Our guest today is Shabbos Kestenbaum. He went from Harvard Divinity School to the front lines of the fight against anti-Semitism. He sued Harvard, testified before Congress, spoke at the Republican National Convention, and he's become one of the clearest voices on Hamas, Iran, Israel, and the moral collapse of the West. Today, we're going to talk about what most people are afraid to say and what too many are refusing to see. Shabbos, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We just saw Hamas return the last hostage after 842 days. What do people in the West still fundamentally refuse to understand about Hamas? Why do they still believe it to be a resistance movement and not a jihadist organization?
Well, I think that's the critical question, especially because I don't think most people in the West even appreciated that there was still a hostage in Gaza up until this morning. So that's number one, just a profound lack of knowledge, which we're also seeing infest and infect so many young people as it pertains to their decision-making on critical issues like Israel or issues facing the West. The second thing that young people, especially in America, don't truly appreciate is that Hamas, and by extension, regular, ordinary, innocent Palestinian civilians are human beings, and they're human beings just like you and me. What do I mean by that? We are capable of making choices in life. We can make decisions, sometimes good decisions, sometimes bad decisions. But young people in America, I believe, particularly because of the political indoctrination they're being fed on college campuses, fundamentally do not believe that Palestinians are human beings who are capable of making choices, which is why every single act that Hamas has done, both since and before October 7th, is never their fault. It is always exclusively categorized and analyzed through the prism of Israel, of Bibi, of Bezalel Smotrich, of the West. They fundamentally do not believe that Palestinians can make their own choices in life. So when Hamas attacks a music festival and kills more than 400 innocent civilians, well, they had to do it because Gaza was a concentration camp, because they had no other option. When Hamas takes innocent civilians as hostage, like Kfir Bibas or Ariel Bibas, and then refuses to give them back, well, they had to do it. They had no other option. And it's fascinating to see what I think is the true Palestinian exception, which is those of us in the West are judged by the choices we make and the actions we take, with the exception of Palestinians. That has been probably the most destructive element of this entire narrative. The fact that so many young people do not think that Palestinians are created in the image of God and are human beings just like you and me. And the other way we see this, another example, is Luigi Mangione. Luigi Mangione, ironically, was a University of Pennsylvania Ivy League graduate, and he shot to death the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, in broad daylight. He had back problems. He had some type of vendetta. And every single age demographic in the United States condemned Luigi Mangione's assassination because it was an assassination. He was a father of four, I think, Brian Thompson. There is one glaring exception, and that is young people. Americans between the ages of 18 to 24 overwhelmingly not only don't condemn what Luigi Mangione did, they condone it. They celebrate it. Why? Because, again, we have been fed a diet of political indoctrination that if you score high enough on the Victimhood Olympics, then nothing you do will ever be your fault. On the contrary, if you are part of the oppressed class, then you have the moral and political obligation to do whatever you find necessary to rid yourself of that oppression, which is why one of the most meaningful, and I say meaningful in a deeply perverse and negative sense, but one of the most meaningful experiences I had at Harvard was shortly after October 7th. And I'm talking to a former friend, a classmate of mine. I won't say her name, of course. And we're discussing October 7th. And quite innocently, she remarks, well, what did you expect was going to happen? This is simply a natural conclusion, as if there was nothing wrong or nothing out of the ordinary of what Hamas did. And that is a profound sickness that the West is experiencing at the moment.
It seems that, when there are Jewish deaths, it's always contextualized. While Hamas violence is justified or ignored, if a Palestinian is killed, there's no reason for that. What do you think are some of the other lies that are still being told about October 7th?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and the answer might be a little annoying because it essentially depends on how you define a lie. So I did a debate recently in Atlantic City, and it was an in-person debate. So there was a crowd of roughly 200 people, and it was actual January 6th convicted felons. It was members of the Proud Boys, who are a neo-Nazi front group. Almost all of the audience members were inebriated, and needless to say, they were not big fans of the Jew. I was heckled nonstop. I killed babies. I killed Jesus. I think the Goyim are cattle. It was a really unpleasant experience. And I didn't particularly talk about October 7th that much, but my debate opponent mentioned it. So I quickly responded to his accusation. And as I'm talking about October 7th, two people in the audience just yell, false flag, to which I responded, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by false flag, because you can watch the Hamas GoPro footage yourself. You can go to hamasmassacres.net or .com, watch the videos yourself, because Hamas was actually quite proud of what they did. Calling October 7th a false flag, that's one type of lie, but the word is not thankfully, but whatever the right word is, that's not like a mainstream lie. That's a lie that's considered on the fringe. So only those in the deepest, darkest corners of Twitter would say that October 7th is a false flag. But a much more mainstream lie, and a lie that's gotten popularity both in the right and in the left, is Israel itself, that Israel is a white settler colonial state, that Israel is an oppressive state, that Israel was built on the backs of Palestinians. I mean, all this is so demonstrably false. And I know my name is Shabbos Kestenbaum, and I wear a kippah, and so people think I'm a little biased. As Nick Fuentes once said, every time I say the name Shabbos Kestenbaum, I feel like I'm committing a hate crime. So I know when I say it, it falls on deaf ears, which is why I often tell people when I do debates, don't listen to me as the right-wing MAGA guy. Just listen to Hamas themselves. They're very proud, number one, of what they committed on October 7th. They're very proud of the fact that they will continue to commit October 7th up until the last child, if that's what it takes. And again, just look at the data. If Israel's a white settler colonial state, then how come Israel is 2/3 Middle Eastern? Very, very few Jews named Shabbos Kestenbaum from New York City are living in Israel. This is not an outpost of white settler colonialism. Even the term settler colonialism, Israel is one of the very few countries on planet Earth where the indigenous inhabitants of the land have actually returned to that land, revitalized their culture, brought back their ancient language. And not only that, but they're doing it in a democratic, pluralistic, multicultural way, whereby there is not a single right that an Israeli Jew has, that an Israeli Muslim does not have. You can't point to other countries in the Middle East that even come close to describing the multicultural, pluralistic society Israel is, which is why I always get a little tickled when far leftists talk about freeing Palestine and what a Palestinian state would look like, because their envisioning of a Palestinian state is this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, two peoples, one state, which A, there's not a single Palestinian leader you can identify either in the West Bank or in Gaza that actually want that, or B, that's literally Israel right now. You are describing a country that currently exists, that 25% of its populace are Arabs. So I get very frustrated at how dumb the talking points have gotten and how detached from reality so many of these narratives have become. And perhaps what's even most frustrating is what I was just saying. Because I'm Jewish and I wear the funny hat, even though what I'm saying is objectively true, the things I just said about Israel being 25% Arab, Israel being 2/3 Middle Eastern, none of those things will be able to convince the other side. Because as much as Ben Shapiro, for example, says that facts don't care about your feelings, the inverse is also true. Feelings don't care about your facts. And I have found in the 2-3 years I've been doing this, that in the face of overwhelming data and evidence and even logic, if someone just feels that Israel is a white settler colonial state, they will not be swayed with facts.
Now, we see what's going on in Iran with the mass killings and just the crimes on humanity, and we see silence in the streets. But when it comes to Palestine, they're out in full force. What does it say about a society when mass rape, murder, kidnapping are met with silence or applause?
Right. I mean, that's the question on our minds these days. I actually just spoke with Jonathan Shanzer, the executive director of the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, and we discussed this very question. Obviously, it exposes the moral bankruptcy and the intellectual hypocrisy of all the campus activists who are just so concerned about human rights and are just so concerned about the oppression of women and babies. They clearly don't care, because even amongst Iranian-owned estimations, at least 20,000 people were killed in a 2-day period. So even if you want to take the Hamas number seriously, which you absolutely shouldn't for a multitude of reasons, but even if you wanted to take the Hamas number seriously, Hamas argues that in the span of a 2-year war, roughly 70,000 people were killed. Now, Israel says at least half of that were Hamas figures. Hamas, for example, does not take into account natural deaths. They don't take into account combatant deaths. But even if you wanted to say that the 70,000 figure is accurate, the fact that you had 20 to 30,000 people killed in Iran in a 2-day period, and there's not even a whisper on the campuses of Harvard or Columbia or Penn or Yale or UCLA or elsewhere, again, really underscores what, to be a little arrogant, what people like myself had been saying, which is these are not activists. These are not human rights defenders. These are people who have an obsessive, compulsive disorder targeted the one and only Jewish state. It's just so obvious. It's not about advancing human rights in the Middle East. It's about scorning and demoralizing one particular state, because the worst thing that ever happened to these people was the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And as they will tell you themselves, they will make it their life's mission to do whatever they can to rid themselves of that historical reality. So it's just, it's frustrating, obviously, but it's also incredibly disappointing. And it's sad that the lives of Iranian civilians who are chanting for the things that you supposedly believe in, they just don't matter to you. And when I expressed this on a show a few days ago, someone said, well, the difference is America is funding the genocide in Gaza. It's not funding the genocide in Iran, which, leaving aside the fact that there is no genocide in Gaza, that point is also not statistically true, because Obama unfroze $150 billion in frozen Iranian accounts. Okay, so the idea that America is not materialistically involved with the ongoings of the IRGC is demonstrably not true. The IRGC, unfortunately, because of the Iranian nuclear deal, had a lot of funding, not just for the crackdown of their own citizens, but also to fund proxies in the Middle East like Hamas. So it's not even a fair point.
Why is it that Israel is always held to a standard that no other country on earth is expected to meet? And has any military in modern history been expected to fight the way Israel was expected to fight in Gaza?
Right. So I'll start with the second question first, which is no. And you can read the works of Lieutenant Colonel Richard Kemp or John Spencer from West Point. They have, or Andrew Fox from the UK. They have documented quite succinctly that no other country on planet Earth has taken the military measures and pains to avoid civilian casualties. Now, it happens to be that if you are a jihadi death cult and you build terror infrastructure underneath hospitals or schools, unfortunately, civilians will be caught in the crosshairs. When you tell civilians, don't evacuate to the south or don't evacuate to the north, but actually stay where you are and become human shields. Again, don't take my word for it. Listen to what Yahya Sinwar was telling on his own Telegram channels. Then inevitably, when you say that we love death and the fault of the Jews is they love life, and inevitably people are killed, then yes, you are going to have, unfortunately, civilians being killed, but that is simply a consequence of every war ever fought in modern warfare. So often at times when I do these debates and I ask the other side, like, what is it about Israel's operations that's a genocide? And they'll say, well, innocent civilians are being killed. And I don't dispute that. Of course, innocent civilians are being killed. The problem with that narrative or that mindset, though, is if that's true, that innocent civilians is how we measure a genocide or not, then literally every single war ever fought in the history of modern warfare would be considered a genocide. But the reality is Israel's not conducting a genocide. They're conducting a targeted military precision campaign against Hamas, who inevitably and explicitly and deliberately and voluntarily put innocent civilians in harm's way. So it's not a genocide by any metric by which you would measure a genocide. That's first and foremost. In terms of this double standard, it's easy for me to, as the Jew, to go back into history and say that there have always been scapegoats. And when you have a largely defenseless, a largely small, but nevertheless largely influential sector of society, in this case the Jews, it's quite easy to blame them for your society's misfortune, which is why Jews, of course, have been blamed for things that are entirely contradictory, like being capitalist, but then being communist, being blamed for not being white, and being blamed for being white. I mean, we really can never win. So it's easy for me to simply say that this is just an amalgamation of a historical pattern that's been happening for 1,000 years. But I think another reason is also Western countries, in particular the UK, France, Australia, they don't really know what it means anymore to be French, to be British, to be Australian. They have ceded so much of their cultural identity to primarily radical Islamists who don't share their worldview at all. And I think Israel has really just been an easy distraction. Rather than discussing the eternal domestic problems that these countries have willingly created, just blame the Jews and just blame Israel. It's much easier. It works for the base. It works to steer up emotions and voters. And again, I know it's a simplistic answer, but when I see people who burn American flags or people who believe in the erosion of American capitalism or democracy, when I see them sending me death threats or, telling me I'm a baby killer, that is an affirmation that I'm clearly doing the right thing. That is an affirmation that I'm on the right side of history. I'm glad that people who burn American flags don't like me. If anything, if they did like me, then I would be a little weirded out. Okay, it's a sign of approval that these low IQ, intellectually challenged flag burners don't like Jews, don't like the state of Israel, and don't like me. Good, I like it that way.
Do you think that The majority of people out there are ignorant about Israel, meaning they misunderstand Israel. Maybe it's through propaganda and things like that. Or do they understand it and reject it anyway because of anti-Semitism and other reasons?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and one that I've grappled with as well. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer, though, is does it really matter? So I'll give you an example. There was this now infamous Wall Street Journal poll conducted about a year and a half ago during the height of the anti-Israel protests on college campuses, and it found that roughly 60% of the college campus activists could not identify the river and could not identify the sea that they were calling for Palestine to be freed from, right? The Jordanian River, the Mediterranean Sea. Now, does that make it better or worse that they're calling for the freeing of Palestine from the river to the sea? I don't know. I do know that former Harvard president Larry Summers has an excellent encapsulation of this problem, which is there's anti-Semitism in intent and there's anti-Semitism in effect. And do many of these students have anti-Semitic mindsets in intent? I don't know. Maybe. Some of them probably do, actually. But it's almost irrelevant because the effect is, in fact, anti-Semitism. So, too, if someone were to wave a Confederate flag in the middle of Harlem, now, it could very well be it's because they don't have any racist bones in their body, but simply because they're celebrating their pride and their heritage of being a descendant of, I don't know, a Southerner Confederate general. But it's almost irrelevant because the effect when you walk through the middle of Harlem with a Confederate flag is, in fact, racism. And at Harvard, I'll give another practical example. The excuse that the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee, that Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine, which were two of the leading anti-Israel groups on Harvard's campus, the excuse they gave in the very early days of the campus protests was we didn't know what an intifada was. An intifada is just Arabic for uprising, right? That's all we're calling for. We're just calling for like a peaceful uprising and democratic change, which do I buy that between you and me? No, I don't buy that for a second, but fine, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. The problem was after they gave that initial excuse, Jewish students led by Harvard Chabad, they had campaigns throughout the campus. They had posters and billboards and flyers educating people this is what the Intifada was, right? So they had the famous Sparrow Pizza shop after it was blown up by an Islamist terrorist. They had gruesome images of babies and nightclubs and nursing homes just being ravaged during the second Intifada. So we Jewish students were saying, hey, if you want to call for an Intifada, this is what the Intifada actually was. Like these are the names of people who were killed during the second Intifada. So we educated them. And then what did Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee and Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine Solidarity, what did they say afterwards? We don't care because that's not what we mean when we say it. So now I can't buy the excuse anymore of they don't know because they've admitted, oh yeah, we know that that's what Intifada means for you. That's not what Intifada means for us. And that is a justification. That is an excuse that would literally never work on any other minority on planet Earth. I would never go to my black friends and say, yeah, I know the N-word, you guys don't like it. I get it. But when I say the N-word, I'm just going back to a place that I find affinity. I love America 1963. It was just, it was a peaceful time. So when I call you the N-word, I don't mean it in a racial way. I'm just hearkening back to a simpler time for us white Americans. That excuse would never work. One, because it's a lousy excuse. But two, it's because I, as a white man, don't get to dictate to black people what is or isn't racist. And the left and the liberals would all agree with that. Yet the only exception they ever make is when it comes to Jews. They feel we can tell Jews what is or isn't anti-Semitic, and if you as the Jew find it problematic, that's on you, that's not on me. It's just a profound sense of moral elitism, really moral bankruptcy, and just stunning levels of hypocrisy.
And we know that the Muslim Brotherhood is central to groups like Hamas and many other terror groups. Why do you think that people in the West insist on treating the Muslim Brotherhood as a political movement instead of an Islamist one that it truly is?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank God for President Trump, who designated the Muslim Brotherhood in 3 countries to, in fact, be terrorist organizations. And thankfully, he's taken a page from Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, and hopefully this is something that's going to spark widespread change across the Western world. There are some Western European countries that have already adopted this measure. So I think from a cultural, political, and legal lens, we're kind of turning a corner here. And I think slowly but surely there has been awakening where people realize that this is in fact an Islamist terrorist group. In terms of why people in the West don't view it that way, I think it really does come back to the answer I first gave in the beginning of this conversation, which is there is no other political or religious cause on planet Earth that will get those who are diametrically opposed to it on paper to actually agree with you in practice. Radical Islam has done something remarkable. They have been able to ally ally themselves with causes like Queers for Palestine being the best example, with communists and socialists, with atheists. And they've been able to do it because they've identified a common enemy. In this case, it's usually the Zionists, but oftentimes it's white people, oftentimes it's Trump and ICE and the billionaire class, but more often than not, it's the Jews and it's the Zionists. And radical Islam has done a tremendous job at supplanting American values in favor of this bizarre red-green alliance, which again, you would never have these individuals allying themselves with each other. But they have a greater common enemy, which I guess is the Zionists. And I think that probably explains why an Islamist organization like the Muslim Brotherhood has up until this point been treated with kid gloves, because it has a profound sense of support on America's most elite or alleged elite institutions of higher learning.
What does Zoran Mamdani's rise tell us about the direction of progressive politics? Why are Jewish concerns about him instantly dismissed or mocked? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay, I'll start with the first question first this time. There was, I'm forgetting who, maybe it was Molly Jung, maybe, but there was a panelist on MSNBC a couple months ago, and they said, when I look at Mamdani, when I look at AOC, when I look at Tim Walz even, I'm recognizing the fact that this is why people are coming to the Democratic Party. And this could be how we plug the hole of people leaving. And I kind of commented and I said, has it ever occurred to you that perhaps the reason so many people are leaving the Democratic Party is because of Mamdani and because of AOC and because of Tim Walz? I registered to vote as a Democrat the day I turned 18, literally the day I turned 18, which is not a very popular way of spending your 18th birthday. Up until Trump, the second time, I only voted for Democrats. I was 9 years old when I knocked on doors for Barack Obama. I was 12 when I volunteered for the Cory Booker campaign when he was running for Senate the first time. I was at the 2016 Democratic Convention as a Bernie bro. I supported Bernie Sanders twice. Most recently, I volunteered for the Jamal Bowman campaign. I took knees with Black Lives Matter. I marched at the Supreme Court when Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I have some degree of legitimacy to talk about the far left because I was the far left. I was part of those movements. And to sort of paraphrase Ronald Reagan, I did not leave the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party left me. I think they have gone in such dangerous directions in the last year. And in the same way, I criticize Nick Fuentes because Nick Fuentes himself doesn't consider himself to be a conservative. He doesn't consider himself to be a Republican. He doesn't consider himself to be MAGA. So why are those on the right and those in the conservative movement bending over backwards to appeal and appease Nick Fuentes and his base? Similarly, Zoran Mamdani does not identify as a Democrat. He identifies as a democratic socialist, which is a very different political party. I mean, not so much anymore, because I think the DSA has kind of taken over the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, they have their own party, they have their own movement, they have their own candidates. And it boggles my mind that the Democratic Party, who are so feckless and are so spineless, have bent over backwards to appeal and appease someone who, just like Nick Fuentes, doesn't even subscribe to your party's base. I mean, pardon my French, but grow some balls. Stand up for the things you believe in. And if you don't, you will continue to lose elections. The lesson that the Democratic Party should have learned after Kamala Harris was that the majority of the American people don't like extremes on either side, right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism. Ironically, I say ironically because Trump's detractors think he's Hitler, but the irony is most of his policies are middle ground conservatism. In fact, there's a good case to be made that had Trump run in the early 2000s or the late 90s, he could have very well ran as a Democrat. But Kamala Harris ran as a left-wing extremist, or at the very least, that's how she was categorized. And if the lesson the Democratic Party takes from her abysmal performance is we actually need to double down and dig deeper into left-wing performative progressive politics, they will continue to lose elections. And it just boggles my mind that this guy, Zoran Mamdani, has been treated with kid gloves. Now, the second part of your question is, what does this say about the Jews and anti-Semitism? I'll say two things. I'm not really concerned about Zoran Mamdani as a mayor because I'm a New Yorker. As much as I moved to LA a few months ago, my residency is in New York. I'm planning on moving back to New York, born and bred. But the mayor's office is very, very limited. He will not be able to accomplish most of the things he has set out to accomplish by himself. So, for example, freezing the rent, well, there's a rent commission. Free buses, well, there's an MTA. Like, he needs to work with other people because the power of the mayor really is limited. What bothers me about Zoran Mamdani is not Zoran Mamdani. It's the permission structure that gave rise to Zoran Mamdani. It's the 1 million+ New York City voters who knew who this guy was, who heard what he was promising and saying and said, yeah, we're going to vote for him. That to me is way more concerning than one inevitably ineffective mayor who will be term limited in 8 years at the longest. So I think that's something that the New York City Jewish community needs to reckon with. Is this the city we grew up with? Is this the city we once knew? And I think one of the most revealing exit polls on the New York City mayoral election was the fact that if you were born and raised in New York City and you lived here for 10 years plus, overwhelmingly you sided with Andrew Cuomo, whereas the reverse was true with Zoran Mamdani. If you're a transplant to this city, if you haven't lived here very long, if you're not from the United States, odds of you voting for Zoran Mamdani are quite high. And I think that's pretty revealing about the demographic makeup of the United States. And the last thing I will say is Andrew Cuomo is a total piece of shit. And I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on your show, even though I voted for him because I have to, because the alternative was an Islamist communist. He was just an awful, awful candidate, and we knew this. And I do think had we gotten a better candidate, Mamdani possibly could have been stopped early on. But Cuomo was and is just such a detestable human being.
Now, you mentioned Nick Fuentes. Why do you think that he is still treated by some as someone worth debating or platforming? And at what point does free speech turn into laundering anti-Semitism?
Okay, there's a lot in that question. First of all, my detractors online are always shocked when I say this because they never listen to a full answer I ever give, which is there is no such thing as hate speech. Okay, hate speech is free speech. There are no limits on what you can call a Jewish person or what you can call a black person. Call them the N-word. Call me the K-word. I don't recommend doing these things because it's awful and you won't get very far in life and no one will want to hire you or associate themselves with you. So I don't recommend it. It's detestable. But from a legal standpoint, you can say whatever you want. And we as Jews need to be particularly sensitive to protecting free speech rights of our fellow Americans. So that's first and foremost. However, as a conservative, and really as an American, I believe in the marketplace, the free marketplace of ideas. And the only way, this is what Charlie Kirk taught me, the only way to combat bad ideas is with better ideas. So I'll get to Nick Fuentes in a second, but just to give you a practical example, I often go on Piers Morgan's show, and there have been so many unfounded accusations in the Jewish community. And I really do say unfounded seriously. I think it's been truly detrimental to our cause that he's been called an Israel hater. He's been called an anti-Semite. He's not any of those things, okay? He's someone who's in the media space, and as someone who's also in the media space, the only thing he's after is viewership and engagement. And if the world was preoccupied with Bangladesh, guess what? He would be focusing on Bangladesh every single hour, every single day. But the world is obsessed with Israel, so that's what he's going to chase after. That's not a damning reflection on Piers Morgan. That's simply a reflection on how media is cultivated in our culture. So he's not an anti-Semite. But point being, though, he platforms people who I detest and I think are destructive to our country. But nevertheless, I go on his show, not because I love it. I don't like being yelled at, especially at 6 a.m. in the morning, okay? But I recognize that Piers Morgan has more weekly listeners than there are Jews on planet Earth. So to surrender that territory, to surrender that space, I think is ill-advised and foolish because Jews are outnumbered quantitatively. There's only 15 million of us. And qualitatively, as much as the anti-Semites say we control the media, I wish we control the media because the media hates us. And what that means, though, is, again, we combat bad ideas with better ideas. And I like to think that I'm playing a very small role in shifting minds and shifting narratives. Going back to Nick Fuentes, though, I would only debate him, and he's called me out a bunch of times. I would only debate him in order to combat what I view his dangerous ideas to young people especially. And if it just wants to be a debate on conspiracies, if it just wants to be an argument on shut up a Jew, then I'm not interested in engagement. But if it will be engagement based upon actual discourse, then unfortunately, I do think it is incumbent upon us, those who believe in the virtues of the West, those who identify as Americans, those who believe in a strong Israel-U.S. relationship, it is in fact, as difficult as it is, incumbent upon us to engage in those difficult debates and spaces.
Speaking about Piers Morgan, I completely agree with you that he's going to speak about anything that's popular at the time. But do you think he's perhaps tougher on the pro-Israel guests than the anti-Israel guests? As an example, he had Natasha Hausdorff on, and he, practically didn't let her speak. And it seems like his views have shifted since October 7th. I'm not saying he's one way or the other. I interviewed Elon Levy. I also interviewed Jonathan Conriquez. Jonathan goes on all the time, like you, and Elon doesn't want to go on. What do you have to say, if anything, about that?
Well, first of all, I'm smart enough to know that you don't disagree with intellectual giants like Elon Levy and Jonathan Conriquez. Or no, seriously, they're role models. They're people I respect and I know personally. And I don't want to. I get where Elon's coming from. I really do, and he's been such a hero and such a fighter in this space. What I will say though is there a double standard by which the pro-Israel guests are treated? Yeah, probably. I mean, I told Pierce to his face that the way he treated Natasha was abhorrent. But so what? I mean, what exactly is the solution? Abandon the space? I think that's probably worse. So yeah, it's a shitty show. I don't enjoy doing it, but it's an important show, and I don't think they're really nefarious motives. I think he's just after ratings, and that's fine. I don't view him negatively for chasing ratings. That's how this game is played.
What do you think about Tucker Carlson? Do you think that he's crossed the line? Obviously, he's not Nick Fuentes, but he seems to be obsessed with Israel and Jews. What are your thoughts on him?
Oh, he's terrible. Oh, he's the worst. He's just awful, awful, awful. And forget about Israel and forget about the Jews. This is someone who has repeatedly implied that our president, Donald J. Trump, is overseeing a child sex ring in the White House and is refusing to release documents that would implicate him. This is someone who's disagreed publicly with every single major policy achievement of the Trump administration, whether it was foreign policy like Iran or Venezuela, whether it's domestic policy like immigration and tariffs. Why this man is invited to the White House, A, is beyond me, but B, from a pragmatic political perspective, will hurt the Republican Party in 2026 and in 2028. This guy's not a conservative. He just isn't. I mean, he talks about the virtues of Nicolas Maduro, a dictatorial thug who has, put his people in a communist hellhole for years. Oh, but he doesn't like gay people, which isn't even true. I mean, Tucker Carlson's not a conservative. He's not MAGA. He has stymied and disrupted and been an obstacle to Trump's agenda for the last year and a half. And I just can't for the life of me understand why there are those in the White House who, at the very least, will refuse to distance themselves from him. And at most, why they continue to invite him. It's such a I'm not trying to get emotional, but it's just so unbelievably frustrating. This guy is trying to bring down MAGA, and MAGA's letting him doing it.
It seems that once he left Fox, his views changed, or perhaps he wasn't showing his real views when he was working for Fox, defending Russia or Iran and all these different things. Do you have any idea of why things changed for him?
I will let much smarter people speculate. He definitely was paid by Qatar to fly to Qatar and then interview some of the governmental leadership there. So that's not me being a conspiracy theorist. I mean, that's just documented in the data and in the facts. He was paid by Qatar to conduct interviews in Qatar. Why is he buying a house in Qatar? Why is he continuously propping up Qatar, saying that they're the only regime, not you won't call them a regime, but they're the only country in the Middle East where the Christian community is growing and where they can freely practice their religion, which is demonstrably not true. So one can reasonably speculate and genuinely ask questions, not the Tucker Carlson asking questions when you're not actually asking a question, but you're positing a theory. But one can actually ask questions as to the sources of Tucker's funding. But I don't just think it's a money thing. I mean, this guy is fabulously wealthy. He had a very nice payout from Fox News when they let him go for defaming Dominion voting machines. But I think part of it is power and influence. I don't necessarily think it's a money thing, but irrespective of why he's saying these things, just like the intent is irrelevant in the face of the impact, so too, why he's saying it is almost irrelevant in the face of he's still saying these things. And we have to combat the things he is saying, irrespective of why he's saying them.
Do you think there's a moral responsibility that comes with a large platform? Where is there the line between having a conversation and legitimizing dangerous ideas?
Well, I obviously believe that there is a huge responsibility to having a platform. I mean, I have nowhere near the numbers that people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Ben Shapiro have, not even close. But I do have my own show here at PragerU called The Brief, and we do have a sizable audience in the hundreds of thousands, and we're incredibly careful about the people we're platforming, about the ideas being expressed, about fact-checking, making sure things that we're saying and they're saying is accurate. And if things our guests say or things that I say are not accurate, then we won't put it out, or we'll apologize. That hasn't happened because we usually tell them the truth, but should that happen, we fact check and we take our audience seriously. We don't treat them like the idiots that Tucker Carlson thinks his audience is, which is why he just continuously lies to them. Another example is this guy, Owen Schrader. He worked at InfoWars until InfoWars fired him. And you have to be a complete moron to be fired from InfoWars. InfoWars is, of course, the Alex Jones media outlet that was successfully sued by the Sandy Hook parents for defamation after after explicitly stating that the Sandy Hook massacre was a false flag. So this guy, Owen, was fired from that show. He was also arrested, imprisoned, convicted for taking part in the January 6th riots. And I'm debating him tomorrow night simply because he has a massive audience. And he put out a video heavily edited of me about a week or two ago saying that I had made it clear that anti-Semites should be imprisoned. And that generated millions of views and so much outrage. And this Jew, Kestenbaum, wants to put anti-Semites in jail. And that's not at all what I said. I said people who break the law, whether you're anti-Semitic, whether you hate Christians, I don't care. The only solution to those who break the law, who commit crimes, is to send people to prison, as opposed to diversion programs, as opposed to cashless bail, as opposed to going to a Holocaust museum. That's what I was suggesting. But this guy deliberately and deceitfully edited what I was saying. So there's a major responsibility that comes with having a platform. The problem is most of the people with big platforms literally don't care. I mean, they genuinely think their audience are just too stupid to research themselves, to watch a 90-second clip. So they edit it down and they cater, they acquiesce, and they placate to the lowest common denominator. I mean, our political culture today is just wildly stupid. I mean, it's shocking how little people know, people who are given prominent positions of power, how little they know about the things they're talking about.
Now, Candace Owens was once sitting in your seat at PragerU. She had her own show, and the shows are still available. I've watched a bunch of them, took some clips where she was standing up for Israel, Jews. She seemed to have a different tune, seemed to be a different person. Nowadays, she completely flipped, and not just about Jews and Israel, but about the whole Charlie Kirk thing, all that. What are your thoughts about Candace Owens?
Oh my God, where do I begin? This is someone who is clearly mentally challenged. I don't know if she experienced what Kanye West experienced, which was, bipolar disorder, which he apologized for. I don't know what happened to her, but this is someone, I'll just give one quick example, who on her show a few days ago said that and she deliberately mispronounced my last name and said, I'm going to be called anti-Semitic for saying this guy's name, but I promise you it's his name. She said that I am working at PragerU on a show, on a documentary, specifically on Candace Owens to take her down. And I know this to be demonstrably false. I'm not working on any documentary. In fact, when I was sent that clip, I texted my boss and I'm like, am I supposed to be working on a documentary on Candace Owens? And he said, what the hell are you talking about? And I showed him the clip. And the reason I bring that up is because I know for a fact that is a blatant lie that she made up. And she said, well, I have 2 verified sources. So I said, okay, fine. Don't tell me who the source is named because you can't. We have to protect their anonymity, right? I said, provide a shred, any piece of evidence, an anonymous tip, a screenshot, an email, a text. Blur the people's names out. That's fine. You got to do it. Provide any shred of evidence that I'm working on a documentary on Candace Owens to quote unquote take you down. I know that she is absolutely lying, which is indicative of who Candace Owens really is. She's a pathological liar who makes things up. That is the biggest problem. It's not the anti-Semitism. It's not the anti-Trump. She is a liar. She says things that she knows is not true. She makes things up. That is the most dangerous thing that any individual with a platform, with a position of power can do, is to simply say things that are not true deliberately. So her example of me, it's a silly small example. Like, who cares if I'm making a documentary or not? I'm not. But again, it's indicative of the fact that this is a dangerous, psychopathic, pathological liar who says things that are not true. I'm going to keep repeating this because it is so dangerous to the young people, especially who watch her. She is treating you like an idiot. When she talks about how Charlie Kirk was killed by the Egyptians, actually it was the French, actually it was the Mossad, actually he's a time traveler. She is making these things up because she thinks you are an idiot. And if you give her money, you are proving her point.
Take us through your time at Harvard. Before October 7th, after October 7th, sue the university, just that whole experience.
In a nutshell, minute or less, I was on the far left. I did all the right things that a good liberal was supposed to do. And the story of October 7th is not the story of October 7th, because Hamas is an Islamic dictatorial regime that should be obliterated from the face of the earth. But they're very clear as to what their goals are. They call for the eradication of the Jew from the river to the sea. So when terrorists commit acts of terrorism, bad, but definitionally, it's what they do. The story is October 8th. Because you had 34 student groups at Harvard, the most progressive, the most sensitive, the most elite, the most educated. They were jumping out of bed to draft an emergency statement to blame Jews for October 7th. That's the true story here. It's not that terrorists commit acts of terrorism. I mean, I was once on a panel with MLK's niece, Alveda King, and she reminded me of a great line from her uncle, which is, "We won't remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." At Harvard, Columbia, Yale, whatever, we would have been lucky to have the silence of our friends. We didn't have the silence. We had the jubilation. We had the celebration, the joy of our friends at watching the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. So look, read the Department of Justice report, read the Anti-Semitism Task Force report, read the House Committee on Education report. But you had Jewish students, like one who was physically assaulted on Harvard Business School, one who was spat on for wearing a kippah, one was told by her professor to leave the class because her nationality made others uncomfortable, hostage posters defaced and vandalized on the daily, Harvard employee threatening me with a machete, saying he wants to debate whether Jews were behind 9/11. I mean, you, of course, have the encampments where they followed me and other students on the way to class. I mean, it was just insanity. It was just absolute insanity. You can read our lawsuit too, but in a nutshell, we filed a lawsuit over the obvious civil rights violations that Harvard was engaging in against Jewish students. Harvard, of course, tried dismissing the lawsuit, but our judge last summer, Judge Richard Stearns of the Federal District Court of Massachusetts, he writes a 25-page scathing ruling against Harvard, writing in part, quote, "The facts as pled show Harvard failed its Jewish students." He tossed out Harvard's double motions to dismiss, and we became the first case in American history pertaining to the civil rights violations of Jewish students on a campus to be allowed to go to trial. Never happened before. And I'm very proud of the fact that there are currently half a dozen court cases brought by Jewish students on college campuses across this country who've cited Kestenbaum v. Harvard. That's a net positive, not just for the Jewish community, but that's a net positive for the American people. That should you be the victim of religious discrimination, whether you're a Jew or a Christian, you should absolutely hold your institutions accountable. If our litigation could be of help, definitely use it. But I'm proud of the fact that we have set legal precedent, that Harvard has structurally changed since the filing of our lawsuit, that the Trump administration has been holding these universities accountable, and that the American people have had a cultural paradigm shift, and they're no longer interested in being beholden to an elitist few who do not share their values.
What message do you have for students on campus now? Advice, or Jews in general? Should we double down on our confidence and visibility, or should we try to blend in? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, definitely don't try to blend in. I think it's actually the Zohar, the book of Jewish Kabbalah, that states that the more the Jews try to assimilate, the more anti-Semitism is manifested as a divine instrument to remind the Jews that you are in fact different. You're not better, but you have a different role in this world. So definitely don't try to be more like others. That's first and foremost. What I will say is a couple of things. Number one, if we as Jews were serious about combating anti-Semitism, which I don't believe we are, we would stop immediately sending more money to Holocaust museums and gala dinners. Instead, what we would do, we would radically and almost immediately reinvest almost all of our dollars into ensuring that there's not a single American Jew today who's going to public school because their parents can't afford Jewish day school. You would make sure that every single American Jew gets the opportunity to go to Israel at least once on a fully sponsored trip. Every single American Jew gets the opportunity to go to a Jewish summer camp at least once. Every single American Jew knows where their nearest synagogue is, or Chabad. That's how you get through this. It is not more Holocaust museums. And I went to Harvard to study the Holocaust, so I have some degree of credibility to say this. It's not more ADL dinners. It's radical reinvestments in Jewish experiences and Jewish education. That's first and foremost. And it's very difficult having to say this time and time again because it's essentially falling on deaf ears. The second thing in terms of the university students is it is far more important, this isn't just true of Jews, it's true of Christians as well, far more important that you have a set of values and of principles that you are unable and unwilling to compromise on. You have a core identity. So for Jews, it should be a love of the land of Israel, a love of your Judaism, a recognition in the importance of the continuity of the Jewish people. That is far more important than any degree, any diploma, any college campus. It just is. And I never tell people where they should or shouldn't go to college, with the exception of Columbia, because Columbia is a hotbed of stupidity and an incubator of just the worst types of people on planet Earth. What I always say is go to an institution where the things you believe in and the things you care about, you can grow with those things. Those things will be amplified and celebrated, and you can be the best version of you that you can be, as opposed to going to a university where you have to bitch on Fox News every week because some idiot roommate drew another swastika. What a profound waste of 4 years of your life. And that's not helping anyone.
If you want to leave us with a final message, where can people find you?
You can find me on social media, on Twitter and Instagram. Just type in my name, Shabbos Kestenbaum. It's a long name, so I apologize. But the good news is there are no other Shabbos Kestenbaum. So I'm the first result. So you could find me there and reach out. But the final message I would say is, look, I'll be a little particular and not universalist, which is to say there's a reason the Jewish people have outlasted the Persians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Babylonians. We've been around for 3,000 years. We'll be around for the next 3,000 years. Okay, Jews don't need Harvard. Jews don't need Columbia. Jews don't need UCLA. It is Harvard. It is Columbia. It is UCLA that needs the Jews. I think that's perhaps the most important message I can leave people with, is recognizing the eternal nature of the people you are proud of. And now I will be a little universal for people who aren't Jewish who are watching this. America would be a much better country if more Christians went to church. It'd be a much better country if more Christians learned and studied the New Testament, and America would be a much better country if more Christians lived a life in accordance with the teachings of Jesus Christ. As Charlie Kirk would always say, get married, have kids, go to church, leave a legacy. And I think it's up to us as young Americans, and in particular young American Jews, to carry Charlie's legacy forward.
Shabbos, I want to thank you for your time, for your courage, clarity, bravery, and wishing you all the best. Lots of success.
Amen. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay.